In discussing the topic of politics in the 1820s, there are two topics that I'd like to deal with. The first is the Missouri Compromise, and the second is the two presidential election campaigns between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. The first one won by Adams in 1824, the second by Jackson in 1828. But first, let's deal with the Missouri Compromise. There was a tradition of pairing one free state with one slave state to keep the number of free states and slave states balanced, so that no one region, north or south, would have the power to overrule the other region in the U.S. Senate. Remember that in the Senate, each state has two senators. So if the number of free and slave states was the same, then the parties, the two sides, North and South, would be equally divided in the Senate. Now, this had been done without any big conflict a number of times. For example, in 1816 and 17, Indiana was admitted as a free state and Mississippi as a slave state. And then in 1818-19, it was Illinois as a free state and Alabama as a slave state. Now, moving ahead a little bit, in 1836 and 37, it was Michigan as a free state and Arkansas as a slave state. But in between, there was a very different situation. In 1820 and 21, Maine was admitted as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. But these I'm putting in red because this pair of states was a huge fight. Now we need to consider what was different about them. So why was Missouri such an issue? Well, first of all, it brought slavery farther north than it had been, at least on a large scale farther north. There were a few slaves in northern states, but no large numbers of them. It extended 100 miles north of the Ohio River, or where the Ohio River ends when it hits the Mississippi. And this made it quite far north. Also, the Federalist Party was gone now. They fell apart after the War of 1812, after they were perceived as being disloyal and unpatriotic. So as a result of that, there's no more two-party system of Federalists versus Republicans. The two-party system would allow Northern and Southerners of each party to work together so that the conflict was more between one party and the other rather than between North and South. But now that there are not two parties, the conflict is more North versus South, and that's a dangerous thing for the country. There was also an amendment in the House of Representatives. It was called the Talmadge Amendment, named after the member of Congress who sponsored it. And Talmadge said, we should write into law that if Missouri is admitted to the Union, there will be no more slaves brought into that state after statehood. And not only that, he said slaves who are there now will be slaves for life, but children born to slaves would be free at age 25. Now, this was a very gradual, moderate phasing out of slavery. But the South went ballistic when they saw this because it was a sign to them that slavery could be phased out and that the North was going to make an issue of slavery. So they vigorously opposed the Talmadge Amendment. The amendment passed the House and lost in the Senate. You should be able to guess why. The House is based on population, and the North had a larger population. But in the Senate, the number of northern and southern states was equal, so it wasn't going to pass the Senate. Now, this is the Missouri Compromise. This is the country as of 1820-21. You notice there is an equal division between slave and free states. The free states in green in the north and the slave states in red in the south. Um, this area here is the Louisiana Purchase, and the issue here is that more and more areas of the Louisiana Purchase are are being considered for statehood. Louisiana is already a state, and now Missouri is applying for statehood, and they are balanced by Maine. Um, but what's going to happen to these territories west of the Mississippi River is very much up in the air, and it's a very hot issue. Now, the Missouri Compromise uh, figured out a way to resolve this issue. What the Missouri Compromise decided was that Missouri could be admitted as a slave state, even though it extended quite far north, uh, but that uh, this line, which is the southern boundary of Missouri, extended westward to the end of the Louisiana Purchase. This line would be a dividing line between future slave and free territories. So all this blue territory here would be closed to slavery, and this yellow territory, which is called the Arkansas Territory, would be open to slavery. That was the compromise, and this territory would eventually be the state of Arkansas and part of the state of Oklahoma. Um, now, so if we look at the provisions of the Missouri Compromise, Missouri is a slave state with no restrictions. That means the Talmadge Amendment is defeated, and Maine is a free state. Now, as I said, west of Missouri, this area north of this line, which is 36 degrees 30 minutes of latitude, this blue area here would be closed to slavery, and this yellow area here would be open to it. Now, you might wonder which side got the better deal. Well, later on, the South complained that the North had done better because that large blue area was closed to slavery. Um, but actually, the South didn't care about those northern lands because they were mainly interested in cotton. And that land in the South is what they really wanted for cotton. You can't grow cotton, in places like Nebraska and the Dakotas, places like that. So the South really didn't care that much about those lands. They were often considered more or less wasteland anyway. The North actually was the region that hated the compromise. Northern senators voted against it, 18-4, but Southern senators voted for it, 20-2. That's why it passed, because the South is really the region that passed it. Now, later on, they would conveniently forget that and complain about the Missouri Compromise. All right, the other part of this presentation concerns politics, presidential politics. Remember that there's no more Federalist Party. John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay became known as National Republicans. They were, earlier we had the Democratic Republicans, or just called Republicans, but now at this point they're called National Republicans. And they were for internal improvements. For example, Henry Clay favored something called the American system that we've looked at before. He wanted the federal government to be actively involved in building roads, canals, bridges, things like that. He wanted an active federal government. Now, Andrew Jackson was on the other side. His followers were known as the Jacksonians. And they represented rural interests, farmers, country people. They hated banks. They hated the northeastern money interests. These are the people who had formed the core of the Federalist Party in the Northeast, and the Jacksonians really hated them. They believed in limited government. This is part of the tradition of Thomas Jefferson. And these two parties, the National Republicans and the Jacksonians, would later turn into the Whig and Democratic parties. The National Republicans would evolve into the Whig Party, and the Jacksonians would evolve into the Democratic Party. Now, in 1824, there were four candidates. Um, Adams, a national Republican, and Clay uh, were uh, were running. Crawford of Georgia and Jackson of Tennessee, but they weren't clearly, uh, you know, part of an organized political party. They were running as individuals, but their philosophies were very different. Now, the electoral votes uh, gave Jackson what's called a plurality, but not a majority. That means he had more than any other candidate, but he didn't have more than half. So there's no majority in the Electoral College. Uh, Now, Jackson also won the popular vote. This was the first election when large numbers of people actually went to the polls and voted for a presidential candidate. And Jackson was the clear winner there. Uh, Now, because there was no majority in the Electoral College, um, the House of Representatives had to decide who would be president. Now, the voting there was done by state, and it was done among the top three finishers. So that means only Jackson, Adams, and Crawford were eligible. Clay was eliminated. Shortly after the election, Crawford had a stroke. So really the issue is between Jackson and Adams. Now, Clay convinced his supporters to vote for Adams in the House of Representatives. So the result was that Adams won on the first ballot. But 3 days later, Adams chose Clay as his Secretary of State. And the Jacksonians, Jackson and his followers, were absolutely outraged by this. They called it a corrupt bargain because it looked to them as if Adams had made a deal with Clay, and Clay sort of passed the presidency on to Adams in return for benefiting personally by becoming Secretary of State. This created the appearance of a conflict of interest. In other words, Clay is acting on his own personal behalf and not simply for what was best for the country. He was the Speaker of the House, so he needed to be acting for what was considered best for the country. Now, I have here, this created the appearance of a conflict of interest. Historians disagree about whether they really made a bargain, and I think probably the majority of historians would say they did not. So the 24 states who voted, Adams got 13 of those states and the presidency, and the other 11 votes were split between Jackson and Crawford, even though Crawford had a stroke. Okay, now the next election, same two candidates are running. This time the results are very different. Jackson wins a huge landslide in both the popular vote and, more importantly, in the electoral vote. And this ushers in what is known as the age of Jackson. Jackson would be a two-term president. John Quincy Adams was a one-term president, just as his father John Adams had been.